Well, thanks very much, Andreas. Again, this is a workshop. I don't have a prepared script. I like to have a prepared script, actually, but I don't. So there's a danger I'll speak too long. Andreas is going to tell me after 15 minutes, and I'll wrap things up. And there's just to help me really, and maybe also to give you some terms to hang on to, I've put together a few notes, really, so there's a one page that everybody should have at this stage. Jeff's book, The Civil Sphere, is a very big book, and there's a lot of ways in which one could approach it. My book is much narrower in ambition. It's primarily a methodological book. I think there might be, some implicit ideas about the good society in it, but it's really a book about how to approach thinking about the good society. So, as I said, it's methodological. For that reason, I'm going to start. There's three kinds of issues I want to throw out into the room. Methodological issues. I think they're more interesting than the word maybe suggests. A second set of issues that have to do with imagination and social change. And the third have to do with this civil sphere as a community of individuals bound by a particular kind of solidarity, which is Jeff's idea of the civil sphere. So I don't know how far I'm going to get, but these are really just thoughts to provoke discussion after Jeff's and after Jeff's presentation. So the methodological issues, the particular tradition of thinking about society out of which my own thinking has emerged is the critical social theory of the Frankfurt School. People like Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and more recently, of course, people like Habermas and third generation critical theorists. In this tradition, which goes back to Marx and before that to Hegel, there's an emphasis on social transformation, which is part of the reason why I started off talking about social transformation as something that is that binds Jeff's and my concerns together. But in the particular tradition out of which I emerge, the imperative, the need for social transformation is central. So, Marx's famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. The emphasis on praxis, on doing something, this is really central. But what's particular, I think, to the Frankfurt School tradition is the worry that people might not be aware of the social causes of their suffering, of the kind of injustices under which they're suffering. They mightn't even be aware that they are suffering. This is the problem that has often been given the title, the problem of false consciousness, or faulty consciousness, or ideology, or whatever. And I think there's a point. I think one has to treat these debates about false consciousness very, very carefully for reasons I'm going to come to in a minute. But I think there is a point to this worry. And in my own work, in fact, ever more, increasingly, I have been reflecting on the question of transformation of perception. So the fact that we might have to transform how people see things as a precondition for social change for the better. But once one starts talking about changing people's perceptions, so transformation of consciousness, one immediately is confronted with another worry, which I call the worry about epistemological authoritarianism. So, if anybody, I've put down on the handout what I mean by epistemological, not authoritarianism. Epistemological, I mean in our thinking about in how we think about knowledge. So, epistemological authoritarianism occurs, in my view, when theorists or a group of people grant themselves or other people, let's say when a particular group of people, be they theorists or activists, are granted privileged access to knowledge of truth in principle. So some people are guaranteed, not guaranteed, but have privileged access to truth. And now, I think this granting of access of knowledge of truth to a privileged group of people runs counter to the emphasis on respect for individual moral agency, which seems to me an indispensable premise of any kind of social action and thinking about social action today. So I think we have to respect individual moral agency, and to do that we have to avoid epistemological authoritarianism. And this means, and I put this on the handout, we have to be open to everybody's claims about the good life or the good society. So there's a need for openness to everybody's ethical claims. This is one aspect of what I call the need for radical reflexivity. And I mean this both, this radical reflexivity seems to be important both on the part of any theory that is concerned with the good society or the good life, but it's also important for people who are on the ground working to achieve the good society and the good life. By radical reflexivity, I mean two things. I mean this openness to everybody's, openness in principle to everybody's claims about the good life and good society, or even specifically their arguments about the good life and good society. But there's another aspect, and I deal with this other aspect under the heading epistemic rigidity, because I think there's a danger for everybody. I'm normally concerned with the danger as it arises on the level of theory, but it arises also on the level of activism. There's a danger of inflexibility and dogmatism in one's thinking about what the good life and good society is. And I call that, my label for that is epistemic rigidity. So any good theory about the good society has to avoid epistemic rigidity, and that means being open to every kind of argument about the good life or the good society. Not just everybody's, that's a kind of democratic requirement, but also to every kind. And I think that can be quite an uncomfortable requirement, actually, and in my some very recent papers I've been trying to tease through some of these things. So how do we do this? How do we ensure this radical reflexivity? And I think one way in which a theory can do it is by being open, or being open is too weak, by maintaining a very strong link between theory and experience. And that's the empirical basis of theory, if you like. And I'm using empirical here in a generous sense, not just in the sense of a theory that relies on observation and experiment, but also a theory that actually draws on real experiences in the world. And I think that's something, connecting. So something that I see very strongly in Jeffrey Alexander's work, and it connects him up with the tradition of theorizing out of which I'm coming, like Axel Honneth most recently, who emphasizes this very much, but also Habermas, and before him the early critical school theorists who said, critical theory starts from the bottom up with the real experiences of suffering. So we start with experiences. The experiences in the world should stop us becoming epistemically rigid, but they won't, because experiences, it's not enough. It's not enough. Because there's a further worry. I think we have to be open to, in order to avoid epistemic rigidity, we have to be open to all kinds of experiences. So not just all kinds of arguments and claims, but claims based on all kinds of experiences. And some of these are likely to challenge us and be disruptive. So the broader challenge is what I call the epistemic reliability of experiences and arguments based on experiences. How can we know that this experience is something worth taking seriously? Just because we feel it's there doesn't mean it's something that's valuable. So I think this is a challenge for theory, for any theorizing about society, is to distinguish or to develop critical resources for evaluating claims about the good life and good society that are made on the basis of experiences. So we can't, because experiences, this I think will connect up with something that Gordon Lynch is going to be mentions in his paper this afternoon. My view of experience is not that experience is entirely constructed socially. I think experiences are mediated in all sorts of ways through subjectivity, which is always in a social setting, through culture, through language, lots of mediating factors. So experiences are never, naive or just out there. And this is one of the questions I would like to ask or to talk about with Jeff afterwards, or I see as a basis for a discussion. In the book, it seems to me, the book is concerned with social movements, or how should I put it? I think there's an immediacy about the ethical claims, or the claims about suffering in the discussions of social movements in the book, which are, it's not that I want to contest them, but I'm saying one can't just rely on, not every social movement is a good social movement, so not every experience, we need a critical apparatus for experience. I wonder how that fits into, I'd like to know more about what you think about that. So this is sort of a set of questions really about critical evaluation of experience. This brings me to the second cluster of questions. Imagination. I think both in Jeff's book, The Civil Sphere, and in my book, The Good Society, there's a strong emphasis on imagination. So imagination is driving, or as a motivating force, and more generally as a driver for social change for the better. Imagination, in terms of what I've just said, I think it's clear that imagination is one important way in which we can counter the tendency towards epistemic rigidity, because the imagination opens up new possibilities and it gets us in all sorts of ways. I mean, I'm not going. I think it's. I'm not going to offer an account of how the imagination works, or what forms of there are literary ways, movies, and so on, poetry, theories themselves speak to our imaginations. So I think the imagination is very important. But the imagination, and this connects back to experience, the imagination speaks to the affects and to the emotions and to the affects more generally, and as well as to the intellect. So I struggle with the question of how to keep the affective and rational components of the concern for social transformation together. I mean, this comes back to the question about experience. Experiences are affective, but we reflect on our experiences. The two things are absolutely bound up together. But we can't emphasize affect, which I think some critical theorists do actually, just suffering. Suffering itself should speak to us. That's right up to a point. We can't emphasize affect without critical engagement, rational engagement with the affect. I think that's true of imagination too. So we also need a critical theory of the imagination. And this is something I wanted to ask Jeff more about as well. Last set of remarks. So I think I'm okay, Andreas, am I? Just about? Yeah, I'll finish up here. This moves in a slightly different direction. I'm really just throwing out some thoughts for discussion here, and they pick up on some things I said in a review essay I wrote on Jeff's book a number of years ago. They're disparate points, I think. Well, one way of connecting up my first point would be to say that in order to avoid epistemic rigidity, we need to encourage and promote encounters with otherness, so other people, but also other forms of otherness. And this seems to be very much part of the utopian idea of multicultural incorporation that, for me, is a central ingredient of Jeff Alexander's book. So this is something that speaks to me. At the same time, I would like to, I think one can't just assume that all kinds of openness to the other are good. I mean, one of the questions I want to raise is, are there pathological forms of openness to the other? So where we lose our identity by, submerging ourselves in the identity of the other. And there's many, I think, examples of that historically. Another kind of question about openness to the other is, how exactly is this going to come about? I mean, what drive? And I think this is something I'm only beginning to think about now. But if, from the point of view of avoiding epistemic rigidity, the kind of encounters with the other that we need will often be disturbing ones that really challenge us in the core of our identity. Now, nobody wants to have a disturbing encounter with otherness. So are these, the kind of question I'm asking is, do we have to just hope these things happen of the same accord? Or are there other ways in which institutionally we can encourage the kind of disruptive, I would call them disruptive encounters with the other that might be important from the point of view of encouraging this kind of identity formation? And that maybe brings me to the second set of questions, which had to do with institutions. Just maybe that's all I'd say. This is something I want to ask Jeff as well. Where do schools and universities and schools from nursery schools onwards, education institutions, are they part of the civil sphere? Are they a non-civil sphere that is in tension with the civil sphere? And I mean, that raises questions again about the boundary between the civil and non-civil sphere. But it would seem to me, irrespective of that question, that education has to be at the centre of any project of the good society. And then we need to think more carefully about educational institutions and educational practices. And I wanted to know more, I wanted to hear more from Jeff about education and educational institution practices. So that's really it.
Oh, and thanks, Maeve. That was really interesting. I have my own kind of response to Maeve's work, and then get as a way of introducing some themes in mine. And then I think I'll come back to the questions she raised, but also those are good for a general discussion. I mean, I've always been connected but separate from the tradition of critical theory. I've maintained there are, as I think Maeve does in the beginning of her book, many kinds of critical theory, not only the Frankfurt School, which is a big point of her work. Maeve says that critical theory depends on having access to the regulating idea of the good society. And this is already kind of a radical reinterpretation of the Frankfurt School tradition. Context, and the good society is an idea that's context independent, she says, but not context free. The good society is separated off from the actual society that we live inside of. And it's not possible for people actually to have the good society in the place we live in our own time. It can never be institutionalized, to use a sociological term, as such. Only some aspects of a good society, or some dimensions, or some elements, but it is necessary to have the idea of a good society institutionalized. And that's very much the core of my own. I agree completely with that, and it's the point I was trying to make about the civil sphere and Martin Luther King. That it's very important to have if you want, the ethical or the moral idea of a utopian world always available. And in fact, it is always available. So I see this continuum from this abstract ethical utopias down to everyday life as it actually is. And everyday life as it is a compromise formation between some realization of aspects of these and the exigencies of institutions, which are not just capitalist ones or market or economics, but all different kinds of institutions which have their own demands. The other implication of, well, not implication, what Maeve says is that the fact that this idea has to be a regulative one and not part of the society as it is means that what the good society is specifically, in other words, what the nature of the institutions, affects, interactions, and identities of the society which is defined as good cannot ever be spelled out. Because that would mean that it can't be separated, really. And I think that's a very important point, and it's of course completely different than, let's say, utopias as they exist in a particular time and place. So a utopia of socialism, or a utopia of a gender-free society, or of a racial integration. These are institutionalized forms of the good society which arise because of social movements or strains or responses to possibilities in a particular time and place. But the utopian content of this regulatory idea has to be consistent with, and this is Maeve's argument, the normative principles of modernity, which she defines, and this is a problem for me, I'll come back to that. Individual autonomy, agency, self-realization, and rationality, which she defines as the normative principles of modernity. And so those are the generalized principles of the good society, which she says are universal capacities, but implies that they've been sharpened and put up front in the historical period that she describes as modernity. So these principles are at the core of the good society, which is the regulative idea that provides a transcendental reference upon which critical thinking rests, and the implication, the capacity for critical social action in a particular time and place. And although I'll come back in a moment to ask some questions about these normative principles and the relation to modernity, I want to say that I basically feel very comfortable with this perspective, and that it is, as I've suggested, at the core of my own idea of the civil sphere. I see it as an organizing, regulative idea, not a set of substantive institutional arrangements, because I wanted to define it in a way which can explain many different kinds of social movements and demands, from the Renaissance, really, or even going back to the medieval parliaments, or going back to the Greek polis, that I believe that actually this idea is 2,500 years old and has assumed many different forms, and will assume many different forms in the future that we don't imagine now. Just as if you would have talked to somebody in 1850 and said that the definition of the good society or a good civil sphere will be where women are completely equal and where they can be independent and don't have to have children, people would have thought that was the most absurd and fantastic thing that they would have ever heard. It would have been considered, or that the notion of disability would be a major challenge for the society, as to realize the civil sphere or a good society, or that gay and lesbian people, that would become a central focus for a whole society for decades, would have seemed laughable, if not criminal. And I suspect that in 100 years, there will be many other things that right now we can't even imagine that will have been raised and come onto the agenda of society, including a global issue, but the civil sphere remains the same, in my view, as an ideal of a regulative idea, and won't really differ that much in terms of its core principles. Because it's been around for a long time, it will become enriched, of course, just as I think the civil sphere as it exists is the result of many intellectual and social movements becoming layered and layered on top of each other, from Judaism and Christianity to socialism, to the to also national revolutions, etc. Now, the convergence between Maeve's vision and mine, or the complementarity, it goes further than this in what I, as a cultural sociologist, because in a way the civil sphere is perhaps two different things. It's a macro sociology in general, and it's also a cultural sociology. It's also normative, of course. Because Maeve argues that the principles of the good society do not operate on society by virtue of their truthfulness. They don't gain their power through the force of rational argument. So it's a radical challenge to, at least in my view, to most of the Habermasian tradition and most of the tradition of, I would say, the Socratic tradition of deliberative democracy, which is based on the notion of argumentation. The power of the good society depends not, she says, on the ontological status or truth, on making arguments for truth, but on persuasion. People in society have to become convinced that there can be a good society. And that we cannot assume an addressee will hear what the good society says. So now what this transforms the rational, let's say, Kantian or Socratic tradition into sociologically as a problem of performativity in terms of its operationalization. And Maeve doesn't say that in that way, but she says it in her way. For persuasion to become possible, the good society must become what she calls a picture. In other words, it has to become an aesthetic force in the moral imagination. So her reference to the imagination, which she made in her talk, is a movement into, of course, aesthetics, and a movement outside of traditional political philosophy, which is traditionally separated from that, and it's an effort to move beyond deliberation. And she even cites Sorel, who's the great anti-democratic thinker, although a socialist thinker at the time. He wrote his work on myth, but she embraces his notion of myth as warmly colored and clearly defined images. So the good society must become, she says, a fiction. That's really, this is a very strong movement from moral to aesthetic theory, or with moral and combining it with aesthetic. And the good society then has to operate poetically to become what she calls an affectively imbued motivating power. To achieve an affectively imbued motivating power, it must have incarnations, quote, in flesh and blood. So rather than convincing via truth or belief, she cites Coleridge's, although she doesn't attribute it to Coleridge, famous declaration that poetry depends on, quote, the willing suspension of disbelief. in other words, entering into a fictive relationship to the principles of what she calls modernity. I call the discourse of the civil sphere, through exactly the kind of experience that King provides in this marvelous speech, which is a form of poetics, which is something we didn't talk about. And if we saw him speaking, if you saw the video, you'd realize that this was an aesthetic and moral experience and not a form of reasoning in a traditional sense. I feel that this pushes Maeve's argument from philosophy into cultural sociology and aesthetics. And it's something I very much, one of the main bases of the civil sphere is to present a critical alternative to the Socratic tradition while maintaining a normative commitment strongly to democracy. But to redefine how democracy works, not just in the age of mass media, which is important, but how it's always worked. Why were there all the schools of rhetoric in ancient Greece? It wasn't just an issue of arguing from truth and rationality as Socrates presents it, that the success of the civil sphere depends on telling a good story and on a narrative, on an aesthetic process of dramatization, which presents a protagonist as a hero or an oppressed subject who can rise up through a process of revelation and provide epiphanic moments of identification, acceptance, and reconstruction, which then allow institutions to be opened up and transformed in some significant way. Let me just make a few notes in conclusion on where I disagree with Maeve, but I don't, there are disagreements, and one is that I don't tie the civil sphere to modernity, but to democracy. The implications of this, I think, are pretty significant because I see modernity as something that's also really awful and good. So I want to say it's both things, and that the principles of modernity are also, there's good principles and then there's bad principles. I'm sure Maeve agrees with me about that, but it's just, to me, there's much too loose a use of the term modernity throughout all of our sciences. So I don't conceive of the civil sphere as a social condition or as but as a discourse, as a way of talking and writing and experiencing that come out of a series of empirical social movements and intellectual developments, which I mentioned earlier. And as such, the principles of the civil sphere, and this is one of the major points of my book, are not just the positive ones of rationality and inclusion, but the negative ones of irrationality and exclusion. So that the civil sphere, our very idea of community, going back to the Greeks, is based on exclusion and inclusion. And that's why the bad parts of modernity aren't residual categories that reflect a failure for there to be a civil sphere, but they reflect the paradoxical quality of any community, which is that all communities are based on who deserves to be part of us and who doesn't deserve to be. And communities spend as much time on working on why people can't be part of our community as they do on how they can, and that's a sad thing, but that's life. That is everything. Who can be part of this university? Well, there's a lot of time spent on that. Unless you get these grades, unless you do this and this, so you can't be. And there's always a sense that when we're inside, others are outside. The dynamic of the civil sphere, as I see it, is about that boundary. Or one of the dynamics is this dynamic interplay of then people say, but I actually deserve to be inside. That the working class deserves to be inside the civil sphere, or the African American, or women, or disabled people, or immigrants. And then the people in the core group of the civil sphere say, no, I mean, this entire society is premised on scum like you not being able to be part of it. So if you want to be part, you have to become exactly like us. Which itself is pretty interesting, because most societies, until modernity, didn't allow anybody to be like them anyway. So, but then there's this negotiation, there's this conflict and intensity about opening up or closing down. And then you have backlash movements like Nazism, or like the anti-immigrant movement, which say, no, we don't want to expand this civil sphere. We want to narrow it, which is a very important dynamic. And I think should be in our minds today, because I think Europe is experiencing, in certain respects, a backlash against the civil sphere, and especially against the idea of Europe as a new European civil sphere, but also partly inside of most European countries. There's obviously a growth of right-wing organizations and possibilities of anti-immigrant backlash. So I think that speaks to this last point that Maeve raised about otherhood and the possibility of rigidity, pathological forms of multiculturalism. My idea is that multiculturalism I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but multiculturalism has to be based on a sense of shared commitment to the idea of a civil sphere, and that it devalues, therefore, particular cultural instantiations of it. For example, in the US, for most of its history, being a WASP was equivalent to being a member of the civil sphere, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Now nobody would ever use the term WASP. Of course, the Irish were victims of the narrowing of the possibility of the civil sphere to WASPishness. They were some of the first victims of that. But that changed, and there's an opening of that, but it's still a struggle in terms of, let's say, Hispanicity and things like that. But today I feel that multicultural has become an N-word in Europe, in many parts of Europe, that people on the left and right are turning against multiculturalism and blaming it for the problems of, for the immigration problems, and saying that the immigrants don't want to become part of European societies. And that they blame that on multiculturalism, which just lets people be as they are and says we should give up everything and just accept all these different kinds of people. So I think it's a very, very real issue today. So I think I made clear that I feel very comfortable, and I've learned so much from Maeve's work in terms of imagination, the idea of I haven't spoken directly about experience, but I mean, when I think about experience, well, let me just tie that to otherhood. The idea of a common experience of life is fundamental to solidarity. And then the way of changing victimized and victimizers' sense of the goodness of their experience is critical. So the second wave feminist movement had to convince women that the experience of subordination and deference, or the experience of femaleness, was a form of subordination. From a cultural, sociological point of view, that was one of the great accomplishments of feminism. Very few women would have said, I feel dominated and subordinated in 1960. 10 or 15 years later, they did. This is a gigantic transformation of consciousness in relationship, in terms of their relation to the civil sphere and the good society. And I think that's what Maeve means by a critical apparatus, a critical evaluation of experience. And Martin Luther King said, as other black leaders say, that his goal was to create a new Negro, a new person who would be very dissatisfied with his or her experience. Finally, about schools and churches, I mean, one of the things about modernity and the social theories of modernity is that they all work with ideas of spheres, of different spheres in society, religion and states, the world of laws, the world of families. Marx's idea of the economic sphere becoming pathologically independent and colonizing the other spheres, or Habermas's idea also. So I put the civil sphere, I said in this book I'm trying to create a new sphere. This is the civil sphere. The civil sphere is as important as the economic sphere, as important as the state, as important as religion. Here's what the civil sphere is. It's a set of discourses and meanings that, if you look at those meanings, they're different from the meanings and discourses of these other spheres. And I also say that there are communicative and regulative institutions in the civil sphere. Communicative are mostly media and civil associations. Regulative are the law and voting. And so I'm trying to define this area. So yes, the thing is that then what about all the other good institutions in society, like schools and churches? And that's always been a criticism of the civil sphere in terms of, schools are more important than newspapers in terms of creating, aren't they? I mean, it seems many people would say they're a hell of a lot more important at creating a good society than some tabloid or even The Guardian or whatever. And churches, because they're so close to the carrier of the ideals of society, my only argument against that is that I don't believe, first of all, there's overlapping between spheres. And I say there's three ideal typical relations. One is a facilitating input to the civil sphere. Another is a destructive intrusion. And then there's the possibility of civil repair. Schools, of course, are primary socialization. That's how sociologists would talk about schools. Not necessarily, that doesn't exclude enlightenment, because learning rationality is also part of socialization, rationality and autonomy. And I think that the schools are obviously fundamental to this, and that's why they're such an object of conflict. I don't think of them as institutions inside the civil sphere, because I don't think that they're primarily related to democracy. I think they're primarily related to socialization. And I don't think the relations inside of schools are very democratic. Although I understand that there's tensions between them and they're being more opened up. But I see schools as fairly authoritarian institutions. Churches, I think, have a different role, which is salvation and purity of the sacred. Although, again, and I consider that quite different from democracy as I identify the civil sphere. But clearly in the history of the United States, the churches have been critical to almost every movement of reform from the American Revolution, where churches were critical to abolitionism, to the civil rights movement, etc.